Hello, welcome to our monthly conversation with Dr. Allen Dietrich-Ward as we explore his book, Cradle of Conservation. This book was one of the products of the Conservation Heritage Project, and over the past few months we've been exploring different aspects of conservation history. So we're excited today to have you join us, Allen. I believe we're looking at rivers as working landscapes. So I'm excited. I got a little sneak peek of some of your slides, so I'm very excited to hear what goes with those slides. As always, if you have a comment or a question, feel free to put it into the chat of whatever platform you're viewing this on, and we will be sure to monitor that and make sure that we answer your question. So welcome, Allen. The floor is yours. I'm going to bring up your program.
Excellent. Marci, it's always a pleasure, and welcome to everyone out there in viewing land, whether you're viewing it on your lunch break, in real time, or you're picking this up later on as our podcast, recording. Welcome to everyone. Yes, Marci, it's Rivers Month here in the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project live stream. And as always, I'm super excited to be here. Now, you'll recall that we started that we spent last month talking about water. So we were kind of talking about water itself, fish, water animals, drinking water. So I thought I'd kind of keep with that theme of water, but change a little bit and talk about rivers as working landscapes. Now, as we talked about before, and those of you who have had a chance to either come to one of my live talks or have read the book, the working landscapes, this notion of lived landscapes, of working landscapes in which natural processes and human societies sort of interlink with one another. That's really a defining characteristic of my book. And we've talked about working landscapes before on our series, but I've never really focused in particularly on the working landscapes that develop around rivers in Pennsylvania. And as much as we kind of talk about, Penn's Woods, right, and we think about the forest, we think about the mountains, in many ways, the defining feature of Pennsylvania is its rivers, its streams, because of course, with a landscape as broken and a topography as varied as we have in Pennsylvania, with living in a temperate environment with adequate rainfall, that's going to result in lots and lots of flowing water. And I think in Pennsylvania, it's really important to recognize sort of the diversity of our rivers, right? We have some of kind of the largest rivers in the nation, but we also have myriad, small streams, and sometimes the dividing line between what a stream or a creek is and what a river is really in the eyes of the beholder. Here in the Cumberland Valley, where I live and where Marci lives. We have these creeks, these three major creeks that anywhere else would be kind of called small rivers, the Connequa, the Connequa, and the Yellow Breeches. And so kind of thinking about the ways in which our riverine landscapes really define and have shaped the development of Pennsylvania society, that we're going to talk about that a bit today. And I think it's really important to note, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, it's the structure of our rivers differentiate us and have differentiated the history of Pennsylvania from some of our kind of most, kind of our closest comparable states, like New York State, right? In New York State, you have this kind of one defining river system which is augmented by humanity, by the Erie Canal, but really links what become all of the major population centers of New York State, from New York City up through Albany to Syracuse to Rochester and off to Buffalo into kind of one big network. Pennsylvania doesn't have that, and it's never had that, right? Our, kind of biggest river system, you can see here on the map, that really, takes, up a third of the state or so, the Susquehanna River. Two things differentiate it from the Hudson. One is, well, it doesn't flow to a Pennsylvania city, does it? It flows down to Baltimore. And that really, in many ways, is this, creates this very different identity of the three parts of our state. Kind of the western part of the state that kind of looks to the west and the south in the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio River basins, and then the eastern part of our state in the Schuylkill and the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers that you kind of look to Philadelphia. But then this vast portion in the middle that doesn't fully identify with either of our major cities, but instead there are plenty of Baltimore Ravens flags here in South Central Pennsylvania. Really associate oftentimes with Maryland. Or New York State to the north. And that really shapes and differentiates us. Of course, the second feature of the Susquehanna is that it's largely not navigable. It's not navigable in the same way that the Hudson River and Erie Canal system is. And that became one of the defining features of Pennsylvania history of how can we connect the east and western parts of our state? How can we make up for this kind of bifurcated transportation system, right? And so the rivers, just as much as the mountains and the forests, really define and shape Pennsylvania history. How does that strike you, Marci? Do you, in your travels across the state, do you get a sense of that kind of different identity based upon the different river systems you encounter?
Oh, absolutely. And I've taught classes on the history on the Delaware, on French Creek, but not French Creek at French Creek State Park, French Creek up by Erie. And then, I grew up on the Susquehanna River, and I personally identify with the Susquehanna River. That's in my blood, so to speak.
Well, and that's exactly it. Okay, so for today, because I know we always have these great visions of all this stuff we're going to cover, and then time just creeps up on us. So what I'm going to do, as usual, is look at three different eras of Pennsylvania history. We're going to think about the people, the places, the policies that we associate with those three different eras. And today we're going to focus on kind of on these river working landscapes. Okay, so I have to start with Pennsylvania's 2025 River of the Year, the Delaware River, and kind of that earliest defining feature of rivers as transportation arteries, right? I mean, these are really in an era before fossil fuel powered or even wood powered locomotives and then cars and roads. It's really the rivers that define economic development and social development. In this era, the rivers pull places together. They don't serve as dividing lines, even though sometimes they're geographical dividing lines, between York and Lancaster counties, for example, right? But it's really this shared landscape of people on both sides of the river. And these early working landscapes in Pennsylvania, whether we're talking about native peoples or we're talking about early colonists, really depend on these rivers as this artery for transportation. And of course, over time, that then also gets translated into river improvements, whether that is clearing out obstacles in the rivers, or that is the development of canals, which is going to then layer this kind of other level of artificial river onto Pennsylvania's landscape. And I think one of the interesting things as we sort of start to look at the development of industry, because of your location on the river, that becomes way more important than sort of, you may only be a couple of miles away by land, but it might as well be 1,000 miles, right? Whereas if something is located on a river, it could be many miles away, but is seen as being closer. The price of coal, it was cheaper to import a ton of coal from Manchester, England, right, to ship it the entire way across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1820s and 1830s than it was to bring that same ton of coal really less than 100 miles or so from the anthracite mines down to Philadelphia. And so that became kind of this desire to sort of transform the rivers or to improve the rivers becomes one of the defining features of kind of early Pennsylvania environmental history. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
So yeah, go ahead, Marci. Did you want?
No, I said interesting. That it would be less expensive to bring it across
Crazy.
the pond,
Crazy. Yep.
so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, and so of course, and this is my one non-river of the group. This is Big Spring Creek here, right in my neck of the woods in Newville. Of course, river power, water power, too becomes as important as transportation in driving community development. Right, you see communities sort of forming around kind of flat, easily navigable stretches of rivers, of course, but then also in places where those rivers can be dammed or those creeks can be dammed for grist mills, for grinding grain, for sawmills, for manufacturing lumber, and then also famously in Manayunk and kind of some of these early other areas in Philadelphia, we start to see the development not just of sort of mills to transform these kinds of natural resources into finished projects, but eventually we're going to see textile mills also spring up in those areas where water power can drive development. Now, again, if we want to make some comparisons, it's interesting here because of the geography and the drop, the particulars of where we see the drop in elevation. We don't see the same sort of heavily concentrated types of textile mills eventually, like we're going to see in Massachusetts and Lowell and other areas, just because of the ways, and well, for a couple of reasons. But in terms of geology and geography, because you don't see that same sort of type of rapid drop in elevation as you approach the coast, because of kind of the Piedmont region that we have in eastern Pennsylvania. Yeah. So, okay. So that's kind of our first stage. Now, as we know, this kind of first era of Pennsylvania's sort of community development, we only start to see a regulation of the environment begin to develop in dribs and drabs, right? We know sort of the famous exhortation to set aside portions of woods, for a long-term sustainability of communities. We talked last week about the development by the 1860s of early laws to prohibit certain types of fishing and to support the migratory fish, particularly the American shad. But during this period, we don't see an extensive focus on kind of protecting natural environments or natural resources. Instead, we see sort of the rapid development and extension of these types of river working landscapes through industrialization. And so if we kind of look here at kind of river transportation, kind of in the early, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, by the time we get through the industrial period, that transportation is going to sort of, be magnified many fold. Here, an example, we have the, the famous Susquehanna log boom in Williamsport. Again, sort of that same notion of riverine transportation being easier, particularly for bulk, than land transportation. But those working landscapes of lumber production in this case, even though we think of lumber production's landscape as being associated with the woods or the mountains, it's really these river environments and the communities that spring up around these river environments that really shape what those working landscapes look like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we kind of go from the early mills of the 18th century, here we have the mighty Bethlehem Steel Corporation, again right along the Lehigh River in Bethlehem. Now, by the time we get to this era, and you'll remember this is kind of an issue all along, but by the time we get to the era of the late 19th century, the ability of rivers to dilute industrial wastes, we've kind of long exceeded that capacity, right? And we see more and more of our rivers, particularly in those areas that have been urbanized, as well as areas that where we see rural industrialization around, coal mines, for example, just become increasingly polluted, right? The ability of those rivers to serve as other kinds of working landscapes, whether it's for fish harvesting, right? Even certain kinds of transportation you can't do. I mean, you can't, the rivers become sort of really fully dominated by Pennsylvania's industrialization to such an extent that they increasingly can't be used for other things. And as we talked about last week, that really is going to give rise to both initially to concerns about the use of water for drinking water, right? And so we're going to see clean water protections, the Water Purity Act and other, eventually leading to Pennsylvania's Clean Water Act in 1970 that really kind of predates or prefigures the federal Clean Water Act. But we're also going to see, as time goes on, an increasing concern about the ability of rivers to harbor animals, riverine animals, whether they're fish and others. And so, at that same moment that we're seeing a policy response to industrialization in the 1970s or late 60s and early 70s, we're going to see kind of a whole slew of river and water oriented policies develop both on the national level and here in the state level. Marci, what's your favorite memory of a river?
Oh, my favorite memory of a river is I'm actually a river rat. That was the mascot for our school growing up.
Oh, yeah.
Down in Columbia. So, a lot of fun memories of camping on the river, both the main stem and the West Branch and the North Branch. So, and again, for me, the river is the Susquehanna River. Although I've paddled the Delaware and the upper reaches, and I've paddled the Allegheny, and they're all so wonderful. But, what you were just saying had me thinking about, we have the industrial pollution. But now we're looking at PFAS and we're looking at medicines in the water, so we still have some pressures, but in some ways they're different because there have been regulations that regulated industry. But times continue to march forward, and how do we address those things like the PFAS and the medicines that we're either putting in through our body functions or dumping down in our toilets when we're trying to get rid of something.
So when you're thinking about your growing up on the river, and I love that story that the river rats. I mean, what a close connection to the river. And I was, as you know, I was just within eyesight of Columbia last week. I gave a talk on Chief Uncas, setting out, from Wrightsville with the Susquehanna National Heritage Area, and that is such a lovely, stretch of river. I mean, you forget that you're on, because of its nature, you really have these kind of like water communities, around the Susquehanna in that area. It's really cool.
And for me, it really influenced my career choice, having grown up along the river, having witnessed Hurricane Agnes and seeing the power of the river. I later owned a house in Bainbridge, which was further upriver. It was such an important part of my life. And we spent summer vacations on the Bennett's Branch to the Cinemahoning, which is a tributary to the Susquehanna River. So really it influenced my career path and my passion for conservation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We see a shift here for a whole host of reasons. The 19th and early, really from 1850 to 1950, we see this turning away. As transportation systems shift away from the rivers to roads, to railroads and roads. We see rivers increasingly becoming inhospitable, not aesthetically pleasing to say the least, but actually absolutely inhospitable, and oftentimes cut off from the very communities that were formed around them, right? And I'm thinking of somewhere like, my focus is on Pittsburgh in the past, and so I think of big portions of Pittsburgh, which really were defined by the rivers, in which people really have no interaction with the rivers because the riverbanks, have increasingly been the residential areas have been increasingly pushed farther and farther away from the riverbanks, as industrialization really sort of takes that space. Now, deindustrialization, right, of the 1970s and 1980s. Shifts that perspective, right? And so really we see this time period kind of post 1950, but then particularly post 1970, as we see big economic shifts and as deindustrialization takes its toll on those mills and other facilities on the riverfronts, there becomes this whole need to reimagine what a riverfront working landscape is. What are rivers for? If they're not, if they're no longer for, transportation from, a particular type of transportation, and they're no longer for, as an industrial sink, somewhere to flush things that you don't like away. What can and should they be for, right? And in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, there's really this big debate, not as much in Philadelphia, but certainly in all of the other industrialized cities of Pennsylvania, of do we reindustrialize those riverfronts, right? Do we focus on sort of rebuilding and continuing to use them for industrial purposes? And I'm thinking here, for example, we talked earlier about the Chester waste incinerator. Like many of those noxious industries, like waste incinerators, like water treatment plants, of course, get put on the riverfronts, right? There are a whole host of reasons for them, but it kind of continues that notion of the working landscapes of the river as being utilitarian, right? As being, as oftentimes being noxious and not, continuing to turn the back on the river as a river itself. On the other hand, we see in many places a turn to traditional uses of the riverfront, or past uses, enjoyment of the river, non-motorized transportation on those rivers. This time for pleasure, right, rather than necessarily for direct economic necessity. Because so many of our riverfronts were dominated by railroads, as we see a shift away from riverfronts for railroad, not an entire diminishment of the railroad, but a shift away from riverfronts for railroad, vast swaths of riverfronts in our cities and in our small towns that basically had been sealed off from people are suddenly now available to them again. And I think that we're still in that process. Every year I see DCNR kind of having a community development project, opening up another community park or opening up another rail trail on a riverfront, in another small community in Pennsylvania. And I put one of our bigger and more well-known, the Schuylkill River Trail here in Philadelphia, as sort of the symbol of this. Here we have this shift back to an orientation toward the rivers, a community orientation toward the rivers in those areas where riverfront redevelopment has taken off.
Yeah, and I think if there's some famous ones outside of Pennsylvania, like Chattanooga or San Antonio, but even like the Delaware and Lehigh Trail is follows a waterway. Yeah, Western Lancaster County has a trail that follows the water. So and it brings in local recreation. It brings in tourism. Mm-hmm. So it has a very positive impact, and it can be used for transportation routes. I love this picture, by the way. That's very serene looking.
Yes. So we kind of have this, this open question of what will the riverfronts, what will the working land, because these are working landscapes. I mean, landscapes of leisure are still working landscapes. There's work to be done, right? Intellectual work as well as physical work. So this kind of question of what role will our rivers serve going forward in these working landscapes of our rivers? What role will they serve kind of in the identity of Pennsylvania as a future? Because on the one hand, we have this kind of post-industrial vision of the riverfronts like we see here on the Schuylkill River Trail, but we also simultaneously have this reindustrialization, this reindustrial vision of Pennsylvania. This is the newly opened or relatively newly opened Shell Petrochemicals complex, oftentimes called the Shell Cracker Plant in Beaver County along the Ohio River, in which you had a former, an industrial site, massive space along the river that, had employed tens of thousands of people during the industrial era, had sort of been abandoned in deindustrialization, and now being reimagined not as a site of new kinds of new types of industrial production, with its attendant advantages and disadvantages. Right, this becomes an economic driver that, just as much as anything else, takes advantage of Pennsylvania's natural resources. Whether those natural resources are access to river transportation, whether those natural resources are the enormous shale gas play of Utica and Marcellus Shale, and this is sort of central to Pennsylvania's identity, and figuring out how to mitigate the negatives while accentuating the positives of economic development really becomes this. That's really the need, the pressing need of public officials today in Pennsylvania. Yeah. So that's kind of our tour. Right on time, about 25 minutes. I'd love for folks in the chat, if we have any questions in the chat, I'm happy to talk about them or answer them. I'd love for folks to give us their kind of memories of their best, kind of river experiences, whether those are river, whatever kind of working landscapes those are, or to throw out ideas for thinking through what will the rivers of tomorrow, the working landscapes of those rivers of tomorrow, what should they look like here in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so if you have a favorite memory of river, please feel free to put it into the chat box. I think, too, it's a good time to mention that many of our waterways in Pennsylvania are water trails.
Yes,
so
that's true.
They lend themselves to both exploration, and many of them have interpretation of the cultural history along the way. So I
just had a lovely kayak trip on the Yellow Breeches Pennsylvania State Water Trail, there in Cumberland County, and I was able to kayak a month or so ago down the Raystown branch of the Juniata, which are both
nice.
Absolutely lovely spots for engaging. And as Marci and I noted, I had my very first river boat talk. If you haven't done it yet, I encourage you to take a look at the Susquehanna National Heritage Area's Chief Uncas riverboat, originally commissioned, Marci, by Adolphus Busch, founder of the Anheuser-Busch beer dynasty. Yep, that was his pleasure boat. An electric boat, all electric boat, 100 years old. So I encourage folks for that. And I should say, as Marci's taking a look at the chat, if anyone wants to catch me live or on Zoom tomorrow night, I'll be giving a talk just across the Susquehanna River from me here in Cumberland County, in Lancaster County. The Lancaster History has invited me to give a talk on Cradle of Conservation tomorrow evening. If you take a look at my social media or the Parks and Forest Foundation social media, it has a link to register. It's free to attend, but folks are asked to register, and you can either attend in person or online via Zoom.
Yeah, I also put it into the chat. It's PA Conservation Heritage, because your talk schedule, you have one coming up.
Yes, on Monday. That's true. They're coming up. They're coming fast and furious. So tomorrow, it'll be the War of the Roses, huh? Cradle of Conservation's.
Yes, it will be.
So tomorrow I'll be in Lancaster, and then Monday evening, at the York Heritage Center, I'll be giving a talk in York on Monday. So please. Come and say hi. We'll have books available, or if you have your own book already that you could get from the Parks and Forest Foundation website, I'll be happy to sign it at either of the events.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thanks for that plug. I will say that I put into the chat box as well, as you were talking, I put in a story that was on the Conservation Heritage Project website about the Susquehanna log boom. as well
Yay!
as Pennsylvania was named in 2024 by American Rivers as the leading state for dam removal. You did
Hmm.
talk about the number of dams that we had, but Pennsylvania is looking at, those environmental impacts of some of those dams, and they're being removed. So
Mhm.
I think we have a shy bunch today. We haven't had any
No
comments
problem.
on their favorite river memory, but I'm sure as you're watching this, feel free to put it into the chat so others
Yep,
might comment on it and maybe learn about a new place to
that's right.
explore.
We're
Yes.
we're on the socials too. So just go ahead and post any memories to the Parks and Forest Foundation socials.
Yes, we're on the socials. I love it. Whole new terminology these days, isn't it?
Bad when you're getting the lowdown from me, Marcy. I just want to say, but
Yes, I get it. Excellent. Well, thank you, Alan. I
my
appreciate
pleasure.
you being here with us. And
Marcy,
again,
do we know what
check
we're
out
doing
the
next month
pig.
yet?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot.
I do it every month, and you're on the spot
I
every month.
should look ahead. Lot of balls in the air. We have our Women in the Big Woods coming up in 2 weeks. So
That sounds great. Well, and keep an eye out that on the socials. I'm sure our trusty intern Martha will post our next month's topic as well. So
I'm sure she will. Excellent. Well, thank you, Alan. Good luck on your next two presentations. And again, check out the PA Conservation Heritage website for Alan's talking schedule, as well as some of these stories that he's talking about from the book. There might be stories captured in the story section. And if at any point you have a recommendation for a story that we should be capturing, please let us know. People, places, and events.
that's right.
Great. All right. Thank you. Enjoy.